In the depths of a Hive city, Caleb Varn clings to duty and habit to survive the Imperium's crushing machine, until one small act shatters everything he thought kept him safe. The alarm klaxon shrieked long before the sun tubes lit, dragging Caleb Varn from the thin warmth of his cot. There was no dawn here, no sky, just the endless recycled rhythm of the Hive dictating when bodies should move. He swung his legs over the side, boots finding the metal floor with a dull thud, and pressed his hand against the activation rune. A faint buzz answered, power fluctuations again. For a moment, the panel hesitated before sputtering to life, spilling weak amber light across the cramped hab cell. The walls were streaked with years of condensation stains, the ceiling bowed slightly from the weight of levels above, and the single air vent rasped like an old man's lungs. It smelled faintly of rust and corpse starch. He washed his face in the trickle of water that passed for a cleansing unit, eyes catching his reflection in the cracked mirror plate. 29 years old, though the Hive had carved deeper lines into his face than his age should allow. Gray-brown eyes, perpetually tired. Skin pale where it wasn't smeared with the residue of machine oils. A scar like a crooked hook ran from his temple to his jaw, a conveyor accident when he was 16. His name had been stamped into the workforce registry that same year, and since then every day had been the same rhythm. Alarm, work, return, sleep, repeat. Today was supposed to be no different. He stepped into the corridor, merging with the tide of bodies shuffling toward the transport shafts. The air was thick with the mingled scents of sweat, ozone, and ration paste. Overhead, speakers crackled to life, the voice of the overseer droning through the Hive like a distant god made of static. All workers of Sector 12 report to designated assignments. Glory to the Emperor. Efficiency is devotion. The crowd moved as one organism, heads down, shoulders hunched, trained by generations of survival to avoid drawing notice. In a place like this, attention could be fatal. Caleb's friend Joran appeared beside him, a broad-shouldered man whose perpetual grin was the only thing that kept him from looking like every other weary soul. "You hear the shaft alarms last night?" Joran asked, his voice low but carrying that forced casualness Hive dwellers used to mask their unease. "I heard," Caleb replied. "Collapsed 2 levels down. They say 40 workers got crushed, or vented, hard to tell down there." Joran gave a short laugh that held no humor. "Lucky us, eh?" Lucky, that was what they called it when death happened elsewhere. Caleb nodded without replying. The lift shaft groaned as the platform descended, packed shoulder to shoulder with bodies. The press of humanity was suffocating, the hiss of steam pipes and the rhythmic pounding of distant foundries filling every pause in conversation. As they descended, the lights dimmed, flickering with the power surges that plagued the lower levels. Somewhere far below, machinery roared like a caged beast. Work in Manufactorum 12 was brutal. Caleb's station lay along one of the assembly lines feeding components for Chimera transport vehicles. Track plates, drive sprockets, armor plating, endlessly repeating parts for wars he would never see. He tightened bolts until his hands blistered, checked alignment gauges until his eyes blurred, and tried not to think about how each plate would end up on some distant battlefield. His world was the clatter of conveyor chains, the stink of machine grease, and the ever-present fear of the overseer's gaze. Mid-shift, the lights went out. A low moan spread through the line as darkness swallowed the chamber. For a few heartbeats, only the hiss of venting steam and the thud of heavy machinery winding down filled the space. Caleb froze, every instinct on edge. Power failures weren't uncommon, but they were dangerous. Darkness in the Hive meant vulnerability, sometimes from structural collapse, sometimes from something worse. The emergency lumens snapped on a few seconds later, bathing everything in sickly yellow. Overseer Bran appeared on the catwalk above, Vox Grill amplifying his voice until it cracked through the chamber like a whip. "Line 7, who shut down the conveyor?" No one answered. The conveyor had stopped itself. That was what scared Caleb. He could see the machine spirits shuddering through the augmetic readouts, blinking strange patterns. Joran glanced at him uneasily. Bran barked again, angrier now. If I find sabotage, the Arbites will bleed this level dry. Work, you worthless vermin. The power returned with a shudder, machines groaning as they lurched back to life. The line started again, but the rhythm felt off. Caleb couldn't shake the sensation that something had shifted, subtly but undeniably. After shift end, Caleb and Joran made their way toward the food dispensary. The line was long, as always, but the talk around them was different tonight. Whispers of inspection teams, of purity checks and increased tithes. An old woman muttered that the Emperor's gaze had turned toward Sector 12, and that never ended well. Joran elbowed him. You ever think about leaving? You know, the upper levels, maybe even a trade vessel off-world. Caleb gave him a flat look. And how exactly do we get past the checkpoints, the quotas, the tithe registries? Maybe someone up top needs workers, Joran said, grinning like he was half serious, half dreaming. We're good with machines, maybe. Dreams get people killed, Caleb cut him off. His voice was harsher than he intended. He sighed, sorry. Joran shrugged. Someone's got a dream. Back in his hab, Caleb stared at the ceiling panel, cracked in one corner, and listened to the hive breathe around him. A sound like distant thunder echoed through the ducts, a shift in the deep levels. He tried to ignore it, tried to convince himself tomorrow would be the same as every other day, but the flickering lumen in the corner seemed to say otherwise. He didn't know that tonight would be the last night he ever returned here. The next cycle began the way they all did. The klaxon screamed, the corridors filled with shuffling workers, the overseer's voice droned through the speakers. But beneath the routine, there was an unease that clung to the air like soot. Caleb felt it before he even reached the lifts. People were quieter, movements more rushed, as if everyone sensed something had shifted but no one dared say it aloud. Joran was waiting for him near the shaft entrance, his usual grin faltering. You hear? Joran asked as they joined the press of bodies. Hear what? Caleb replied, though his stomach already tightened. They sealed level 40 last night. No warning, just locked the gates and rerouted the workers. My cousin's down there. Joran's voice was low, his eyes flicking nervously toward the surveillance lenses mounted in the corridor. Caleb swallowed. Level 40 was 4 strata below their own. Sealing a level wasn't unheard of. Sometimes structural collapses forced containment, sometimes contamination. But usually there were announcements, reassignment notices. Sudden, silent sealing was different. It meant something had happened the administratum didn't want spreading. The lift rattled as it descended, chains groaning, vents wheezing under the pressure of thousands of bodies breathing the same stale air. Caleb tried to focus on the routine, count the turns of the gear wheel outside the cage, watch the rusted indicator lights flick past. Routine meant survival. Routine meant not thinking too hard. Manufactorum 12 greeted them with its usual cacophony, but even here, whispers had taken root. Overseer Brands pacing on the upper gantry was more frantic than usual, his vox grill barking orders at random intervals. At least 2 conveyor lines were shut down entirely, guarded by black-armored enforcers whose presence set Caleb's nerves on edge. Enforcers didn't usually bother with lower-level workers unless there was sabotage, heresy, or something worse. Caleb took his place on the line, hands moving automatically to tighten bolts and check gauges. But his mind wasn't in it. The emergency shut down yesterday, the sealed level, the enforcers. It all threaded together into a pattern he couldn't quite see yet but could feel. 2 hours into the shift, the line stopped again. This time it wasn't a power failure. Warning klaxons blared and crimson lights flooded the manufactorum, bathing everything in a bloody glow. All workers remain at stations, the overseer's amplified voice commanded, brittle with barely contained panic. Inspection protocols initiated. Obey and you will not be harmed. Caleb's heart lurched. Inspections were rare in their sector, and when they happened, they were brutal. The last one had left 17 workers dragged away in chains, accused of inefficiency and spiritual corruption. None had returned. A squad of black-uniformed Arbites entered through the far doors, flanked by hooded adepts carrying Auspex devices and incense sensors. The Arbites moved like predators through a herd, boots striking the metal floor with mechanical precision. Their carapace armor was polished, their shock mauls humming faintly. Behind them came a figure in deep red robes, taller than the rest, its face a mask of gold with lenses that clicked as they adjusted focus. Mechanicus. Joran whispered, "Emperor's mercy," but Caleb didn't respond. His pulse thundered in his ears. The inspection began methodically. Workers were pulled from the line, scanned with Auspex arrays, questioned, sometimes struck. A middle-aged woman 2 stations down was accused of contamination. Why, Caleb couldn't hear, but the Arbites didn't need proof. They shackled her wrists and dragged her away, her cries echoing through the chamber. When they reached Caleb's section, the red-robed adept's gaze lingered on the conveyor machinery, then on him. It stepped closer, servolimbs whirring softly, and held a wand-like device near his head. It emitted a soft chime. "Designation Caleb Varn," intoned one of the hooded adepts, reading from a data slate. "Worker efficiency, above standard. Devotional attendance, adequate. Contamination, none detected." The Arbites moved on. Caleb let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, but relief was short-lived. The line had been disrupted, and disruption in the Hive always had consequences. By the end of the cycle, rumors had spread like fire in dry tunnels. Some claimed the sealed level had been overrun by mutants. Others whispered about a psyker discovered among the workers. A few said nothing at all, but their silence spoke of fear too deep for words. Caleb tried to shut it out. Fear was dangerous. Fear made you noticeable. But when he returned to his hab, exhaustion pulling at his limbs, he found a small piece of parchment slipped under his door. It was stained, torn at the edges, but the message was clear. "Do not report tomorrow. They are coming for Sector 12. His hands trembled as he read it again. The handwriting was hurried, uneven. He didn't recognize it. Panic clawed at his chest. A trap, a cruel joke, or a warning? Joran, he needed to show Joran, but even as the thought formed, doubt followed. Joran was his friend, but in the Hive, desperation could make friends into informants. What if Joran reported him? What if the message itself was bait, left by enforcers to catch dissenters? Sleep was impossible. The Hive's endless mechanical pulse seemed louder than usual, pressing against his skull. Every distant clang sounded like boots approaching. He lay awake on his cot, eyes fixed on the ceiling, replaying the message over and over. They are coming for Sector 12. By the next cycle, tension had hardened into something tangible. The transport shaft was clogged, workers pushing forward with a frantic energy. Overseer announcements barked about increased quotas and glorious duty to the Emperor, but the words rang hollow. Caleb caught sight of enforcer patrols moving in formation through the corridors. In the Manufactorum, things were worse. Entire sections of the line were offline. Bran barked orders like a man drowning. The Arbites returned, this time in greater numbers. Whatever was coming, it was close. Joran found him at break period, slipping through the throng with an expression Caleb had never seen on his face before, naked fear. "Caleb," he hissed, pulling him behind a stack of crates. "We need to talk." Caleb showed him the parchment. Joran's face went pale. "Where did you get this?" "Under my door last night." "You think it's true?" "I don't know," Caleb admitted. "But look around, something's happening." Joran bit his lip, glancing toward the catwalk where Arbites were gathering. "We could try for the vents. If we move fast, maybe we can get to level 30 in." A sudden klaxon cut through his words. Not the usual shift change alarm, but a long, rising wail that froze every worker in place. Emergency evacuation protocols. Brand's voice cracked through the vox, distorted, frantic. Containment breach. All workers remain at stations. Repeat, containment breach. The lights flickered. Something deep within the hive roared, not a machine this time, but something alive, vast and furious. The floor shuddered beneath their feet. Workers screamed. Arbites began barking orders, herding people toward lockdown points. Caleb's heart hammered. The parchment's words flashed in his mind. They are coming for Sector 12. And then, through the chaos, came the first distant sound of gunfire. The first gunshots echoed like distant thunder, carried through the labyrinthine corridors of the hive, reverberating off the iron walls until it was impossible to tell their origin. For a heartbeat, the entire manufactorum seemed to hold its breath. Then panic detonated like a chain reaction. Workers broke from their stations, scattering in every direction. Overseers screamed through vox units, but their commands were drowned beneath the tidal surge of human fear. Caleb was swept along in the crush before he could even think. The line workers around him shoved and clawed to reach the exits, but those exits were already being sealed by the Arbites. Massive bulkheads groaned as they descended, slamming shut with the finality of a tomb. The crimson emergency lights stuttered and dimmed, then flared brighter, casting everything in a feverish glow that made faces look skeletal, hollow-eyed. Joran grabbed Caleb's arm, yelling over the noise, "The vents, now!" It was madness, but so was everything else. Caleb let himself be pulled, weaving through the chaos toward the rear maintenance corridors. These were narrow, half-forgotten passageways lined with corroded pipes and flickering lumen strips, usually ignored by everyone but servitors. A small grill near the floor led to the ventilation system that threaded between manufactorum sectors. If they were lucky, it might still be unsecured. Behind them, the gunfire grew louder. Not disciplined volleys like Arbite's suppression fire, but scattered bursts, frantic and wild. There were screams too, high, raw, cut short. Something had breached Sector 12, and whatever it was moving closer. They reached the vent just as the lights flickered again. Caleb knelt, wrenching the grill loose with shaking hands. It came free with a rusty screech that made his skin crawl. Joran clambered in first, wriggling forward into the narrow shaft. Caleb followed, pulling the grill back into place behind him as best he could. Inside, the air was stale and hot. The metal walls pressed close on all sides, forcing them to crawl on elbows and knees. Every movement echoed down the shaft, magnified by the confined space. Caleb tried to steady his breathing, but his heart pounded so hard it seemed to fill the tunnel. "Where does this go?" he hissed. "Level 31 if we keep left," Joran whispered back. "I used to sneak through here during shutdowns. No patrols." Caleb nodded, though Joran couldn't see it. Level 31 was still deep within the hive, but it was far enough from Manufactorum 12 that they might avoid whatever was happening. Maybe. Minutes crawled by. The noise from outside was muffled but constant, distant alarms, collapsing machinery, the occasional burst of gunfire. Then, abruptly, something shifted in the air. A low vibration ran through the shaft, like the hive itself was growling. Caleb froze. What was that? Joran didn't answer. Ahead of them, a faint light flickered. Not lumen strips, something organic pulsing faintly. Caleb's blood ran cold. The hive's ventilation shafts sometimes became breeding grounds for vermin, but this was different. The light pulsed in rhythm, like the beating of some vast heart. They crept closer. The shaft widened slightly into a junction where multiple tunnels met. And there, clinging to the walls like some fungal growth, was a patch of pale, veined matter. It pulsed wetly, spreading tendrils into the surrounding vents. The air around it stank of rot and chemicals. Joran gagged. "Emperor protect us, what is that?" Caleb didn't know, but instinct screamed at him to keep moving. They bypassed the growth as quickly as the cramped space allowed, crawling into the left tunnel. The smell lingered, clinging to their clothes and skin. Not long after, they reached a vertical shaft with a ladder bolted into the wall. The rungs were slick with condensation, but it was their only path upward. Joran started climbing first, his movements hurried and uneven. Caleb followed, glancing down occasionally into the darkness below. Halfway up, the ventilation shaft reverberated with a distant, inhuman shriek. It was high and keening, echoing through the tunnels until it felt like it came from everywhere at once. Joran froze on the ladder, his knuckles white. Caleb's throat went dry. He had never heard anything like it, not the shrieks of dying workers, not the groans of failing machinery. This was something alien. They climbed faster. When they finally emerged into the access corridor on level 31, both were slick with sweat and shaking. The corridor was deserted, lumen strips flickering overhead. For a moment, Caleb almost believed they'd escaped. Then they heard the sirens. They weren't the standard evacuation tones, but something deeper, older. A wailing klaxon that meant only one thing: a breach by non-human forces. Caleb had never expected to hear it in his lifetime. That sound was supposed to belong to distant battlefronts, not the buried guts of their hive. Joran slumped against the wall, panting. "We have to keep moving. If they're sealing 1231 won't stay open long." Caleb nodded numbly. He didn't need to ask who they were anymore. The parchment's message, the inspection, the sudden lockdown, it all pointed to the same grim conclusion. Something had infiltrated the hive, and the Imperium's response would be as ruthless as the threat itself. They moved through the dim corridors, passing shuttered habs and abandoned workshops. Occasionally, they saw groups of workers huddled together, whispering frantically. Most ignored them. A few looked up with wide, desperate eyes, as if hoping Caleb and Joran held some answer. But they didn't. They were nearing the sector's transit lifts when they heard the boots. A squad of Arbites rounded the corner ahead, weapons raised. Their sergeant barked an order, and before Caleb could react, he was slammed against the wall, shock maul pressed to his chest. "Sector 12 workers," the sergeant growled through his Vox grill. "Why aren't you at your stations?" Joran stammered something about being reassigned, but the Arbites weren't listening. They scanned the two men quickly with Auspex devices. "Negative contamination," one Arbite reported. "Orders are to quarantine all 12 workers," the sergeant said. He gestured. "Detain them." Caleb's stomach dropped. Quarantine in Hive terms meant disappearance. No one came back from quarantine. But before the Arbites could move, the sirens changed pitch. A new voice crackled through their comms, urgent, panicked. Caleb couldn't hear the words clearly, but the reaction was immediate. The sergeant stiffened. "Fall back to containment perimeter," he barked. The Arbites turned to leave. For a heartbeat, Caleb considered staying quiet, hoping they'd forget him and Joran in the chaos. But one Arbite glanced back, saw them still standing there, and raised his weapon. Joran acted first. He shoved the Arbite hard, sending the man stumbling into his comrades. "Run!" he shouted. Caleb didn't think, he ran. They tore down the corridor, the sound of boots pounding behind them. Caleb's lungs burned, his legs screamed, but adrenaline kept him moving. They darted into a side passage, then another, twisting through the maze-like halls until the pursuit faded. They finally collapsed in a maintenance bay, gasping for breath. Joran laughed weakly, the sound half hysterical. "We're dead men, Caleb, you know that, right?" Caleb couldn't argue. They were fugitives now in a hive tearing itself apart from within. Even if they avoided the invaders, the Imperium's response would be swift and merciless. But something inside him, some stubborn spark, refused to surrender. "We're not dead yet," he said, surprising himself with the steadiness of his voice. "There has to be a way out." Joran looked at him like he'd grown a second head. "Out, Caleb, we're in the bowels of the hive. There's nowhere to go." But Caleb's mind was racing. The vents had led them here. The Arbites were falling back to containment lines. The Administratum wouldn't waste resources saving people like them. but they might have escape routes for higher-ranking officials. Emergency transit shafts, maybe, if they could find one before lockdown completed. Before he could explain, a new sound rose from the depths. It wasn't sirens this time. It was the distant, thunderous rhythm of massed feet or claws marching through the hive. And above it, faint but growing, came the sound of chanting. The chanting rose like a tide, strange and discordant, winding through the hive corridors as if the metal itself carried the sound. It wasn't the disciplined cant of the ecclesiarchy, nor the raucous hymns of drunken workers. It was low, fevered, 1,000 throats murmuring in ragged unison. Caleb felt the hairs on his neck rise. He had heard hymns all his life, from the shrieking sermons blasted through Vox horns at shift changes to the funeral dirges that echoed through the hab stacks whenever another section collapsed. This was different. This was alive and wrong, as if some deep infection in the hive had found its voice. Joran edged toward the maintenance bay's doorway, peering out cautiously. "That's coming from below," he whispered. Caleb joined him, squinting into the flickering corridor. The sound was indeed drifting upward from the lower levels. Faint lumen glows pulsed along the walls in rhythm with the chanting, as though the hive itself were responding. Caleb thought of the veined growth they'd passed in the vents and felt his stomach knot. "We can't stay here," Caleb murmured. "No," Joran agreed. "But where do we go? Transit lifts will be locked. Arbites are sealing sectors, and if that," he gestured downward, "is what I think it is, then—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Caleb thought back to his brief, terrifying encounter with the parchment-bearing clerk. The inspection, the sudden lockdown, the growth in the vents. It all pointed to one thing: infiltration, infection, something alien spreading unseen through the hive's bowels. And now it was no longer unseen. The chanting grew louder, and with it came the sound of marching boots, Arbites this time, disciplined, heavy. A squad was advancing down the corridor toward their hiding place. Caleb and Joran ducked back into the shadows of the maintenance bay just as the first black-armored figures came into view. There were 8 of them, their carapace armor gleaming dully in the emergency lights, shotguns at the ready. Their leader, a burly sergeant with a cracked aquila painted across his breastplate, gestured sharply. 2 Arbites broke off and began checking side passages. Caleb held his breath. If they were found, they'd be detained or worse, quarantine. He remembered the Arbites earlier, how quickly they'd moved to detain any worker from Sector 12. If these troopers discovered them now, there would be no escape. The Arbites moved closer. One of the searchers paused outside the maintenance bay, sweeping a portable Auspex scanner across the doorway. The device beeped softly. Caleb's heart lurched. Before the Arbite could investigate further, the chanting below swelled suddenly into a wild, frenzied roar. It was as if some signal had been given. The Arbites stiffened, exchanging tense looks. Then the floor beneath them trembled. A dull boom echoed up from the lower levels, followed by another. Dust sifted down from the ceiling. The sergeant barked orders and the squad formed up, weapons raised, preparing for something. Caleb and Joran watched, frozen. The next sound was a scream, human but barely. It was a sound of pure terror, cut short by a wet crunch. Then came the gunfire, distant but growing closer by the second. The Arbites formed a firing line across the corridor, facing the direction of the lower levels. The first figure to emerge from the stairwell wasn't an alien creature but a worker, staggering, blood-soaked. His eyes were wide and empty, his mouth working soundlessly as he stumbled forward. Behind him came others, dozens of them, their bodies twisted, their faces slack with ecstasy or madness. Their flesh was marked by strange symbols cut into their skin, and their voices joined the chanting with a fervor that made Caleb's skin crawl. The Arbites didn't hesitate. Shotguns thundered, tearing into the front ranks. Bodies fell, but more surged forward. Caleb realized with horror that this wasn't a panicked mob, it was an attack. These people, these workers like him, had become something else, something united by a purpose he couldn't understand. Cultists, Joran breathed. Emperor save us, it's a cult. Caleb had heard whispers of such things, of course. Everyone had. Tales of hidden sects worshipping forbidden powers in the depths of the Hive. But those were stories told in hushed tones during off-shifts, not something real, not something here. The Arbite's line began to falter under the press of bodies. The cultists weren't armed with guns, mostly, but they attacked with suicidal fervor, wielding makeshift blades, tools, even their bare hands. They didn't care how many of them died. Caleb, Joran hissed, grabbing his arm. We need to move now. They slipped out the back of the maintenance bay, avoiding the main corridor and heading deeper into the service passages. The air grew hotter and more oppressive the farther they went, the thrum of machinery vibrating through the walls like a heartbeat. Joran led them through a maze of narrow shafts and half-forgotten tunnels. Occasionally they heard distant gunfire or the echoing chants of the cultists, but they saw no one else. The Hive felt like it was holding its breath between heartbeats, waiting for something terrible to arrive. They emerged eventually into a wider transit tunnel. A cracked sign overhead identified it as one of the old maintenance lines, unused for decades but still connected to the larger network. Rusting tracks ran off into darkness in both directions. This could take us out of the lower levels, Joran said, hope flickering in his eyes. Caleb hesitated, and if it's sealed? Then we find another way, but staying here means dying with them. Caleb nodded reluctantly. They started down the tunnel, their footsteps echoing eerily. The lumen strips here were dim and uneven, casting long shadows. Every creak of metal made Caleb's heart jump. After what felt like an eternity, they saw movement ahead, a faint light bobbing rhythmically. They ducked behind a support strut, watching. A small group of people was coming down the tunnel toward them. Not cultists this time. Their movements were too cautious, their lights too steady. As they drew closer, Caleb saw they were workers like himself, 4 men and a woman, all armed with improvised weapons. Their leader, a gaunt man with a shaved head and a scar running across his cheek, held up a hand when he spotted Caleb and Joran. "Stop," he hissed. "Who are you?" "Sector 12, Joran replied quickly. "We're just trying to get out." The scarred man narrowed his eyes. 12 sealed. How'd you get here?" "Vents," Caleb said. The group exchanged wary glances. Finally, the scarred man lowered his weapon slightly. "Name's Bren. We're heading up level. There's talk of an evacuation route near the old administratum lifts. You're welcome to follow if you can keep up." Caleb and Joran didn't need convincing. They joined the group, moving quickly through the dark tunnels. Bren explained in terse whispers that the cult uprising had been festering for months, unnoticed or ignored by the authorities. Now it had erupted in full force, coordinated with frightening precision. The Arbites were stretched thin, and worse, there were rumors that something else was moving through the Hive alongside the cultists. Something inhuman. Caleb remembered the veined growth in the vents and the alien shriek they'd heard. His skin prickled. They traveled for what felt like hours, climbing stairwells and squeezing through maintenance shafts. The Hive above them groaned and shook occasionally, as if massive forces were shifting deep within its structure. Eventually, they reached a wide access hall leading toward the old administratum sector. The air here was cooler, cleaner, a sign they were nearing upper levels, but it was also eerily silent. Bren raised a hand, signaling for quiet. They moved cautiously forward. The hall opened into a grand atrium, long abandoned, its once ornate statues of imperial saints cracked and worn. Dust hung in the air like mist. And then they saw them. At the far end of the atrium, gathered around a sealed lift shaft, was another group of cultists, dozens of them. They hadn't noticed Caleb's group yet, but it was only a matter of time, and among them, towering over the chanting throng, was something else. It was humanoid, but only barely. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid. Its head was elongated, ridged, and its eyes burned with a cold, alien intelligence. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. The cultists were trying to force the lift open. If they succeeded, they'd have access to the upper levels, and there was no telling what horrors would follow. Bren looked at Caleb and the others, his expression grim. "We either turn back and die in the tunnels," he whispered, "or we go through them." Caleb's heart pounded. The choice loomed like a guillotine. For a moment, no one moved. Bren's words hung in the air like the weight of the hive itself pressing down on their spines. Caleb could hear the cultists chanting at the far end of the atrium, their voices echoing off the cracked stone walls in a feverish rhythm. The alien creature loomed over them like some dark priest, its elongated head turning with slow, predatory grace as it surveyed the shaft. It tapped its clawed fingers against the lift doors as if impatient, and each metallic click echoed like a death knell. Joran leaned toward Caleb, his face pale and slick with sweat. "We can't fight that," he whispered. Caleb didn't need to be told. Even if they managed to slip past the cultists, that thing wasn't something improvised blades and courage could overcome. Its presence alone seemed to distort the air, bending it around itself like a shadow stretching against the lumen light. He had heard stories of Xenos in the fringes of the Imperium, whispers about things that infiltrated hives before planetary defenses even knew they were there. But those were distant nightmares. This was real. It was here. Bren studied the atrium, his eyes narrowing. "There's a side passage," he murmured, pointing toward a series of crumbling arches on the right-hand wall. "Service tunnels. If we're careful, we can circle around and hit the lift controls from the maintenance chamber behind it. We lock the shaft down, buy ourselves time to escape through the upper ducts." Caleb followed his gaze. The passage he pointed to was half-collapsed, filled with rubble and tangled pipes, but it might be navigable. "And if they notice us?" Caleb asked quietly. Bren's answer was simple. "Then we run faster than they do." No one liked the plan, but there was no better one. Staying here meant waiting for the cultists to break through the lift and flood the upper levels. Turning back meant descending into the growing chaos below. This was their only path forward. They moved silently, hugging the shadows along the atrium wall. Every step felt like it could betray them. Caleb's breath came shallow and fast, his heart hammering so loudly he was sure the cultists would hear it. He kept his eyes fixed on the alien creature. Its head cocked slightly, nostrils flaring as if it scented something in the air. Caleb froze, every muscle in his body seizing. But then it turned away again, focusing on the cultists working the lift mechanism. They reached the arches without incident. Up close, the service tunnel was worse than it had looked from a distance. Metal pipes crisscrossed the entrance like veins through flesh, and half the floor had collapsed into a dark pit that smelled of rust and stagnant water. Bren went first, slipping between the pipes with practiced ease, the others following one by one. Caleb squeezed through last, scraping his shoulder on jagged metal as he did. The tunnel beyond was narrow and claustrophobic, lit only by the dim glow of malfunctioning lumen strips. Condensation dripped from overhead pipes, spattering their faces like cold sweat. Somewhere deep in the hive, machinery groaned like a slumbering beast turning in its sleep. They crawled forward for what felt like hours, the tunnel twisting and descending before turning sharply upward again. Caleb's knees ached, and his palms were slick with grime. Joran muttered curses under his breath, barely audible but constant, like a mantra to keep himself moving. Bren led with absolute focus, occasionally stopping to check old maintenance markings scratched into the walls decades ago. Finally, the tunnel widened, opening into a small maintenance control chamber. Ancient cogitator banks lined the walls, their screens cracked but still flickering with dim runes. A grated floor ran over a nest of cables that hummed faintly with power. In the center of the room was a lift control panel, a mass of levers, wheels, and rusted switches. "This is it," Bren said, kneeling beside the panel. We can lock the shaft from here, maybe even flood it with coolant, but it's going to be noisy. Once we start, they'll know. Joran glanced nervously back down the tunnel. Then we better make it quick. Bren started working the controls, his fingers moving with surprising dexterity for a Hive worker. Caleb and the others formed a loose perimeter around the chamber, weapons ready, listening. The chanting still echoed faintly through the tunnels, but it was distant, muffled by layers of stone and machinery. For a few precious moments, Caleb allowed himself to hope. If they sealed the shaft, maybe they could find a way out. Maybe they could survive this. Maybe. Then the cogitators screamed. A high-pitched alarm blared through the chamber, red warning runes flaring to life across the control banks. The lift's locking mechanism had engaged, but so had its emergency override. Someone down there had triggered a countermeasure. "Damn it," Bren snarled, slamming his fist against the panel. "They've bypassed the main lock. I can stall it, but not for long." The chanting outside shifted, rising in intensity. Caleb's stomach twisted as he realized what it meant. They knew. The first cultist burst through the tunnel entrance moments later, eyes wild, blade raised. Joran swung his makeshift wrench in a desperate arc, catching the man across the jaw with a wet crunch. He collapsed, but more were behind him. The chamber filled with chaos. The workers fought like cornered animals, not with skill but with the raw, desperate fury of people who had nowhere left to run. Caleb grabbed a length of broken pipe from the floor and swung it with all his strength, connecting with a cultist's shoulder. Bone cracked. The man didn't even scream, just kept chanting through bloodied lips until Caleb hit him again. Bren shouted over the din, "Keep them back, I just need more time." But time was the one thing they didn't have. Through the crush of bodies, Caleb saw movement in the tunnel, a shadow stretching unnaturally long. The alien creature was coming. He felt it before he saw it, the air growing thick, the lights flickering as if recoiling from its presence. When it entered the chamber, the fight stopped for half a heartbeat. Everyone, cultist and worker alike, turned toward it. It moved with fluid grace, its talons clicking against the metal floor. Its head tilted as it regarded the humans, and a low, chittering sound rose from its throat. Caleb had never known such fear. It was a cold, total thing, reaching down into the deepest parts of him and freezing everything solid. He understood in that moment why Hive cities fell. It wasn't just the claws and the fangs. It was the sheer wrongness of the thing, the way it unmade the courage of men just by existing. Bren yanked a lever with a final, furious twist. The entire chamber shuddered as the lift's security seals locked into place. Somewhere above, coolant valves hissed open, flooding the shaft with a deadly mist. The creature reacted instantly, letting out a screech that made Caleb's ears ring. It lunged forward, impossibly fast. Joran tackled Caleb out of the way just as the creature's claws sliced through the space where his chest had been. Metal screamed as the alien carved through control banks like paper. Sparks exploded, filling the room with smoke. "Run," Bren roared, "back through the tunnels." They didn't argue. The workers scrambled toward the tunnel entrance as the creature tore through the chamber behind them. Caleb didn't look back. He could hear it, though, the sound of metal rending, the inhuman shrieks, the cultists following in a frenzy. They crawled through the service tunnel like rats fleeing a fire. Behind them, the alien's screech echoed closer. Caleb's hands slipped on the grime-slick floor, his lungs burning as he forced himself onward. Bren was in front, shouting directions, urging them faster. Then the tunnel split. Left led upward toward a forgotten stairwell. Right led deeper into the Hive. Bren didn't hesitate. Left. They clambered up the narrow stairwell, half running, half crawling. The air grew colder, fresher, a faint draft whispering from somewhere above. They were close to the upper levels. Caleb was almost at the top when a sound froze him mid-step, the distinct clanging of something entering the stairwell below. Slow, deliberate. The alien was following. Bren reached the top first, forcing open a rusted hatch with a grunt. Light spilled down the stairwell, a brighter, cleaner light than Caleb had seen in days. The upper ducts. Freedom. "Move," Bren yelled. Caleb surged upward, every muscle screaming. Joran was right behind him. As Caleb hauled himself through the hatch, he caught a glimpse of the creature below. Its head tilted up toward him, its eyes locking with his. It moved faster than anything should. He slammed the hatch shut just as it reached the top of the stairs. Metal bent under the impact, the entire frame shuddering. They were safe for now. But Caleb knew it wouldn't last. The hive was burning below them, and something alien was loose in its veins. And above, there was nowhere left to run. The alarms began before dawn, though down here in the hive, dawn was nothing more than a rumor from some forgotten sky. The klaxons bellowed through the walls like enraged beasts, vibrating the metal beams until flakes of rust snowed down from the ceilings. Merrick jerked awake to the sound, his heart slamming against his ribs before his mind caught up. For a second he thought it was the same shift sirens as always, the kind that summoned thousands of tired bodies into endless labor. But this sound was different, longer, deeper, like a machine forced to scream. It was the kind of alarm they'd been told they'd never hear. A red light spun wildly in the communal bunk space, painting everything in a panicked crimson. People tumbled out of their stacked bunks, bleary-eyed and confused, some already pulling on work smocks as if their minds couldn't process any alternative to the rhythm they'd lived their entire lives. Old habits, Merrick thought grimly, die last of all. Then came the voice, cold and mechanical, cutting through the confusion with brutal indifference. Section 44C breach detected. All citizens report to designated muster points. Section 44C breach detected. The word breach sucked the air out of the room. Everyone froze. There were stories, whispered in the dark corners of work shifts about breaches, about outer walls failing, about xenos, about things the administratum never acknowledged. Sometimes people went missing after telling those stories, but this was no rumor. Alina appeared beside Merrick, her face pale beneath the pulsing red light. "Did you hear that?" she breathed. He nodded, forcing his limbs to move, reaching for his boots. "We need to go, now." They joined the surge of people flooding the narrow corridors, the sound of thousands of feet echoing like thunder trapped in a cage. The hive had never felt more claustrophobic. The walls seemed to close in with every step. Somewhere above, a deep boom reverberated through the structure, followed by a tremor that rattled teeth. Someone screamed. The corridors forked and the crowd split, half going toward the designated muster points, the other half pushing against the flow, desperate to get away from the breach. In that moment, Merrick understood something terrifying. The hive's protocols were built for obedience, not survival. Those who followed orders might be marching straight toward death. Alina tugged his arm. "We shouldn't go to the muster. Merrick, listen to me. If the wall's broken, they'll seal us in with whatever's out there." Her words landed like a blow. He remembered the stories, sections that vanished overnight, containment measures, whole hab blocks erased from records. He swallowed. Where then? She didn't answer right away, scanning the branching tunnels. Another explosion shuddered through the hive, closer this time. The lights flickered, and for a heartbeat everything went dark except the red strobes. That was when he saw him, the Overseer. Overseer Havoc stood on an overhead walkway, barking orders into a Vox unit. His face, normally smug and complacent, was drawn tight with panic. Behind him, armed enforcers shoved people toward the muster gates, and just for a second their eyes met. Havoc pointed directly at Merrick. "There, stop those two." Merrick's stomach turned cold. "Run!" he shouted, grabbing Alina's hand. They plunged into the left-hand corridor, shoving through bodies. Behind them, boots pounded in pursuit. Enforcers. The tunnel sloped downward, into the older maintenance levels. Merrick's lungs burned as they ran. ducking under low pipes and leaping over grates slick with runoff. The sounds of the hive grew stranger the deeper they went, distant shrieks, metal twisting, something vast moving through spaces that shouldn't have held anything living. They stumbled into an abandoned pumping station, massive turbines looming like fossilized giants. Alina doubled over, gasping. He recognized you," she wheezed. Merrick leaned against a rusted railing. "He's been watching me since the protest, probably had me marked as agitator." She stared at him wide-eyed. "Then they're not chasing us because of the breach, they're chasing you." Another boom shook the floor, dust raining down. A section of the far wall split open with a metallic shriek, revealing a gaping hole. Cold, stale air poured in. Beyond was darkness, not the darkness of unlit halls, but the open void of the lower hive edges, where the structure thinned into caverns no one was meant to see. And then they heard it, a sound like claws scraping against steel, slow, deliberate, coming closer. Merrick's blood turned to ice. "We can't stay here." They fled again, weaving through the guts of the hive until they emerged in an old transit tunnel. It stretched endlessly, rails rusted and half-buried. Ahead, emergency lights flickered. Merrick could hear distant gunfire echoing through the hive now, sharp and panicked, like the sound of reality breaking. "Alina," he said softly, "whatever's happening, this isn't just a wall breach." She looked at him, tears streaking grime down her face. "I know." They pressed on, following the tunnel until they reached a set of blast doors half-sealed, leaving a crawlspace beneath. Merrick dropped to his stomach and wriggled through first, scraping his back on the jagged edges. Alina followed, and for a brief moment they were both wedged tight in the cold metal, breath shallow, heartbeats loud. On the other side they found themselves in a forgotten loading bay. A single service lift stood against the wall, its panel flickering erratically. Merrick hit the button, and the cage door rattled open with a groan. They stepped in, and the doors slammed shut behind them. The lift shuddered as it began its slow ascent toward upper levels. From somewhere below came an unearthly screech that made Alina clutch Merrick's arm. It was a sound no human throat could make. As they rose, Merrick's mind raced. He'd spent his entire life crushed under the weight of the hive, never imagining he'd try to escape it. But now every step was carrying him toward something new, freedom or death, he couldn't say. The lift jolted suddenly, stopping between floors. Merrick slammed the panel. Nothing. Above them, something scuttled across the ceiling like a massive insect. Then came the impact. The entire lift shook violently, metal groaning under strain. Alina screamed as claws punched through the roof mesh. Merrick reacted on instinct, grabbing a rusted pipe from the corner and jamming it upward into the hole. A shriek answered him, high and furious. He jabbed again, forcing whatever it was to retreat, but only momentarily. The lift resumed moving with a lurch, racing upward as if the machine itself sensed danger. When the doors finally opened, they stumbled out into a corridor that was almost eerily quiet. Emergency lighting cast everything in harsh orange. Abandoned tools, overturned carts, and streaks of something dark lined the floor. The silence was worse than the noise had been. They moved cautiously now, every step echoing. Somewhere far away, the hive still roared and screamed, but here it felt like the world was holding its breath. Merrick's hands trembled, not from exhaustion but from the weight of realization. Everything was changing. And then, rounding a corner, they froze. Ahead stood a figure in battered flak armor holding a lasgun, but the weapon hung limp at his side. His eyes were wide, unblinking. Behind him, through a cracked viewport, Merrick glimpsed the impossible, a chasm torn through the hive wall, opening into the black void beyond. Shapes moved out there, not human shapes. The soldier's lips moved soundlessly. Then he turned to them and whispered, hoarse, "It's already inside." The corridor lights died, and something moved in the dark. The darkness that fell was absolute, a smothering void that swallowed even the faintest glimmer of emergency lighting. Merrick froze where he stood, the soldier's last whisper hanging in the air like a dying ember. Beside him, Alina's breath hitched audibly, shallow and uneven. Somewhere ahead, in the thick black, something shifted with a slow, dragging scrape that made the hairs on Merc's arms rise. In that moment, he understood with bone-deep clarity that whatever had breached the hive was no simple malfunction, no distant war that might bypass them. It was here, and it was hunting. A pulse of red emergency light flickered to life overhead, weak and intermittent. It cast brief, stuttering glimpses of the corridor, the soldier standing rigid like a broken statue, the jagged hole in the viewport, and shadows that seemed too thick, too alive, crawling against the edges of vision. Merc's hand found Alina's, gripping tight. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Every breath they took felt like it might be their last. Then came the sound. Not a roar, not a screech, but a clicking, fast, irregular, like bones tapping against metal. It echoed through the hallways, bouncing off walls in ways that made direction impossible to determine. Merc's instincts screamed to run, but where? Up led to enforcers and lockdown gates. Down was the breach. The only thing he knew for certain was that staying still was death. He tugged Alina's hand and pulled her toward a maintenance access door on their right. It was half ajar, as if someone had forced it open in panic. They slipped inside and found themselves in a cramped service shaft lined with pipes and cables. The air was damp and metallic, heavy with the stink of coolant and rust. Merc shut the door behind them as quietly as he could, pressing his ear against the cold metal. The clicking grew louder, closer. Alina whispered, "What is that?" He didn't answer. Some truths in the Imperium were better left unspoken, even in whispers. But deep down, in that part of him that had heard the rumors whispered in factory queues and on graveyard shifts, Merc had a sickening suspicion. Genestealers, tyrannid infiltrators, monsters that turned entire hives into graveyards before the wider Imperium even realized something was wrong. If that was true, then this was already over. They climbed deeper into the shaft, careful not to make noise. The passage twisted and narrowed, leading to an inspection platform overlooking one of the hive's cavernous arterial tunnels. From here, Merc could see the chaos unfolding far below. Emergency lighting turned the tunnel into a nightmare tableau. Civilians stampeding like panicked animals, enforcers firing blindly into the dark, sections of the wall collapsing as unseen forces tore through them. The hive, their entire world, was unraveling. Merc leaned against the railing, his chest tight. He'd spent his entire life dreaming of escape, imagining some life beyond the smog and the factory lines. But he'd always pictured that life as out there. Now he realized there was nowhere to go. The Imperium did not allow for escape. You were born into the machine, and you died in it. "Alina," he said softly, "look." She followed his gaze downward. Her hand tightened on the railing as she saw it. A group of enforcers trying to hold a barricade at one end of the tunnel. Their formation broke as something fast and low slammed into them from the shadows. Lasfire flared, brief and useless. Screams followed. "We can't go down there," she whispered. "No," he agreed, "but we can't stay here either." Another explosion rocked the hive, this one so violent that a section of the platform buckled beneath them. Alina cried out as she lost her footing, Merc grabbing her just in time. But the sound of the collapsing metal must have drawn attention, because from the darkness behind them, a shape emerged into the faint red light. It was humanoid only in the most nightmarish sense. Lithe, elongated limbs ended in claws sharp enough to gouge steel. Its head was smooth and eyeless, mouth split into rows of glistening fangs. It moved with a disturbing, predatory grace, lowering itself to all fours as it advanced. Alina's scream caught in her throat. Merc didn't think, he acted. He grabbed a length of piping from the ground and swung wildly as the creature lunged. The impact barely staggered it, but it was enough to buy them a heartbeat. He shoved Alina toward the access ladder at the far end of the platform. "Climb." She didn't argue. She scrambled up the ladder, hands slipping on the greasy rungs. Merc followed close behind, the creature slamming into the ladder's base, making the entire structure quake. His muscles screamed as he climbed faster than he ever had in his life. He didn't dare look down, but he could feel it below, climbing after them, claws clicking against metal. They burst out onto another corridor through a rusted hatch, slamming it shut behind them. Merc jammed a metal rod through the handle, praying it would hold. For a moment, the only sounds were their ragged breathing and the distant chaos. Alina collapsed against the wall, tears streaking her face. "Merc, what do we do?" He didn't know. For the first time, he had no answer. All his life he'd endured by keeping his head down, following the rules, believing that if he just survived each day, something would change eventually. But the Imperium didn't reward endurance. It only consumed. A sharp bang on the hatch snapped them out of their daze. The creature was trying to force its way through. The rod bent slightly under the impact. Merc scanned the corridor. Ahead he saw something that made his stomach twist, an evacuation tram line. The platform was deserted, the tram itself dark and cold, but the track lights still glimmered faintly. It might lead upward. It might lead to a sealed dead end. But it was their only chance. "Come on," he said, grabbing Alina's hand. They ran down the corridor, boots echoing. The hatch behind them screeched as claws tore through it. They reached the tram just as the sound of pursuit filled the hall. Merc smashed the control panel with his fist, and by some miracle the machine sputtered to life. The doors hissed open, and they stumbled inside, slamming them shut again. The tram lurched forward down the tunnel. Through the front viewport, Merc saw flashes of Hive infrastructure whip past, industrial arteries, hab corridors, collapsing support struts. The entire Hive was coming apart at the seams. Alina sat across from him, clutching her knees to her chest. Do you think we'll make it?" He didn't answer, because ahead in the darkness of the tram tunnel more clicking echoed. Shapes moved on the walls, skittering along the ceiling like monstrous spiders. Dozens of them. The tram accelerated, but they were fast, unnaturally fast. They clung to the tunnel's edges, gaining. Merc's heart pounded. There was nowhere left to run. No cavalry coming. No salvation. Only the machine grinding on and the things it had let slip through its cracks. He met Alina's gaze. There was terror there, yes, but also something else. Defiance. For the first time, Merc understood that maybe survival wasn't about finding safety. Maybe it was about choosing how you met the inevitable. The tram burst into a massive vertical shaft, rising toward the Hive's upper layers. A faint, almost forgotten light filtered from far above, pale and distant, like the memory of a star. Merc rose to his feet, gripping the rail as the creatures closed in behind them. He had nothing but a broken length of pipe and a lifetime's worth of rage. "For the Emperor," he whispered, not out of devotion, but because it was the only thing left to say. The first creature smashed through the rear window, and Merc swung. The tram roared upward into the light. And the Hive screamed below.